Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Monika Amsler, who is a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of Classics. She holds a PhD from the University of Zurich and has also served as senior researcher at the University of Bern's Department of Ancient History and the Classical Tradition. Dr. Amsler is the author of the Babylonian Talmud and Late Antique Book Culture, published by Cambridge University Press in 2023, which is what we are going to talk about today. This book, by the way, is open access, so you can read it for free, and we will provide a link to the book below the description of this recording. Dr. Amsler, congratulations on the publication of your new book. And thank you for sharing your time and expertise with Talmud for Everyone for its segment called Two Scholars and a Talmud. It's customary
for
for
having
us.
me.
Yes, thank you for being with us. We usually ask our distinguished guests to speak a little bit about how they became interested in what they did. How did you come up with the idea for this book?
So, yeah, thank you for this question. It's always great to be talking about the roots or think about them again. I think when I first read something from the Talmud, I just fell in love with the duct of the document. I just thought it was so intriguing and enticing. It's like it's like a box of chocolate. You never know what you're gonna get. As Forrest Gump says, you
It's
really never
convoluted.
know what's gonna come up on the next page. And so it was quite clear that I would write a master's thesis on the Talmud. And well, it's not something to brag about. The title was the magic of the Talmudic tractate Shabbat. So I wouldn't I have learned since this master's thesis, but it was a good experiment to read through a whole tractate and to really engage with the text. And then I wrote a dissertation proposal where I proposed to look deeper at the medicine, the medical recipes in Tractate Shabbat and also beyond in the Talmudic corpus. And I started working on these recipes, and I soon realized that they all have the same shape. And beyond the attribution to some rabbi, they all start with the same clause, the same formula. Take this and that, and then they have the same structure. And if not, then do this and that. So and this you can see this pattern across several tractates, always with these recipes. So I started wondering, how was the Talmud actually made? How I mean, these rabbis did not talk stereotypically. This is just not something I believe in, because we have other recipes who are formulated differently. And there are also recipe books, Greek recipe books mainly, that have actually the exact same structure in their recipes. So I thought there must have been a recipe book in the back of these recipes, and someone just cut it apart and inserted it in different tractates. And so at some point, I had to decide, should this become a dissertation that is about the medicine or about book production? And in the end, the dissertation was something in between. And I had to disentangle it for the book project. And so you will find some articles of mine about actual medicine in the Talmud. So, but this is how this came into being.
In fact, in your book, and this now clarifies some matters for me, I think it's the fifth chapter deals with medicine, um, and you're trying to figure out the sources of these materials and how they were arranged in the Talmud. So that's an interesting background to learn about your master's thesis,
Yes,
moving
actually,
up.
yeah. It's actually become the last chapter of the book and also the appendix where I recompose this medical treatise, with I think 47 recipes.
And just jokingly, we should
Yeah.
say to our viewers, children, please do not try this at home. I mean, some of these recipes are not medical in the scientific sense of the term. As you were saying, your book deals with how did the Talmud come to be? When you were working on your master's thesis, I understand it, you were intrigued by the medical materials, but then a much broader question of like, how were these materials brought together? Basically, how was the Talmud written, by whom, and when? Now, before we discuss your position on this very complex matter, how the Talmud came to be as a written text, maybe you could describe for our audience what is the current scholarly consensus, if there is one, on this matter.
Yes, it's really it's always what is the scholarly consensus and where is a consensus made and who makes it. So usually when I give a talk on my thesis about how the Talmud is made, I have a lot of pushback by the audience. This is not, we don't believe this, we think this, we don't believe in an oral transmission. So I thought, okay, for this purpose, I will be reading the classical Oxford Dictionary, dictionary's entry on the Talmud, which was just published in August, right? And actually, the entry is just saying that yes, it is believed that the Talmud was orally composed by rabbis who talked to each other and then used professional memorizers to memorize the knowledge and the discourse, and then it was passed on. And eventually, at some point, they decided to write it down. So I think this is the consensus. But as I said, I feel that like everyone who's working with the Talmud has kind of their own idea about how this all played out. And of course, we also hear about documents in the Talmud. So some people think that eventually they wrote something down and then it was communicated orally again, and then it changed while it was communicated orally, and then it was written down again. So we see also a bit of this stereotype between something that is written is fixed, and when it's communicated orally, it's changed. But then again, there is the idea that professional memorizers memorized things and then they were fixed in their memory. So there are a lot of issues around this. And basically, what I think it serves to distinguish the Talmud from other documents, written texts in late antiquity. So there is always a bit of this idea that the Talmud is sui generis. It's one of its kind. It has no parallel elsewhere.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that topic about the alleged uniqueness of the Talmud, which is one of the questions I have for you. But so basically, the classical definition you provide there, you went to the Oxford English Dictionary. Just what's there?
No, a classical dictionary,
Oh,
dictionary
classical
of
dictionary. Got you. All right. Yeah. Um, and which, from what I got, is stressing on the one hand the orality of the Babylonian Talmud. We're talking Babylonian Talmud here, just as a clarification for our audience. Um, that it's an oral text transmitted for several generations. Maybe at some stages there were some written notes or some written text, but essentially this was a very prolonged project that finally
very
came
long, yeah.
to an end sometime towards the end of the late antiquity, so maybe 6th, 7th, 8th century CE. So that's sort of the scholarly consensus, if there is one, and it overlaps a
Yeah.
little bit even with the traditional, I might say, confessional understanding of how the Talmud came, which is like, yeah, these are sages who memorized Torah and then they transmitted to the next generation and so forth. And one day they needed to write it down for whatever circumstances or whatever
Yes,
reasons.
it is actually quite a literal reading of of the text.
So now we can talk about your approach of assessing how the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, so what most Jews and non-Jews read today. Nobody reads the Jerusalem Talmud except some specialists, I suppose, and other amateurs. And you try to think of the production of the Talmud within its historical context by looking at other Greek and Roman works from antiquity and late antiquity. Maybe we should explain what those periods are for our audience and looking how those texts were written, what compositional strategies were used to then inform your thesis about the production of the Talmud. Could you share? I know you wrote an entire monograph on this topic, but maybe in a nutshell, what your thesis is then about the composition of the Talmud.
In a nutshell, I would say the Talmud is was composed like any other book in late antiquity, and the imperial period, and which we would say for our purpose now covers the year 0 to 700 CE, where we see that books were predominantly produced out of other books. So most texts rely on prior texts citationally. So they cite a lot. They use a lot of quotes and whole passages from other books, which then they use in other contexts, reframe, rephrase, etc. So yeah, this is actually what I propose, and I'm also jumping to the conclusion of my book, since we already started with the fifth and last chapter. So, I mean, the elephant in the room is always, but they say there is written Torah and there is oral Torah, or Torah from the mouth, Torah shebe'al peh. They actually say this, so why don't believe the rabbis, or why do I not believe that this was really just an oral text and it was never written down prior to that, and the rabbis did not write down their teachings? I think we just have to complicate this a bit. I think foremost for the rabbis, this was a conceptual distinction. There is one Torah that is written. And we see that during the time period under discussion, it became more and more prescribed. How do you have to write the Torah? What ink, how it should be lined, what kind of parchment. The Torah really became a ritual object in itself. So Torah writing distinguished itself from any other kind of writing. But then we have, of course, just casual writing on tablets, on pottery shards, which we call ostraka, on papyrus scraps, just regular writing without lines, and which had a much lower status. People were offended when they received a letter on an ostrakon. It's just, what? You sent me a shard? Or people make up excuses. I'm sorry, I did not have papyrus, so I'm writing on this shard. So I think actually my book intertwines well in complexifying oral Torah with a book that you have already reviewed, Isaac, Rebecca Wallenberg's closed book, where she complexifies actually written Torah and says, but written Torah was also oral, and the rabbis, were actually anxious for people to read from the scroll, or to write it down. They thought it should be memorized. So, I think this goes together. We have to complexify
Right.
both concepts.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that stand out there. I mean, one of them is, I mean, for newcomers listening to this that don't know anything tabula rasa about the Talmud, they might not appreciate how how your thesis, and I'm saying this in a positive way because we need this in academia, new ideas to stimulate our understanding about the history of religions, in this case, the history of late antique Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, how radical your thesis is in some ways, or it's going against the consensus, this idea of orality. You're saying, no, look, we have if we look at other books, works that are roughly contemporaneous to the Talmud, we see that they're based on written texts. They were using written sources. So why not think of the Talmud in that way? And feel free to correct me if I'm paraphrasing you wrongly, your ideas wrongly. We can take, for example, Pliny the Elder is one author that you mentioned in your book, his extensive work on natural history, presumably drawing from written sources as one example. So looking at the context, looking at the time, seeing how other works are produced, and wondering how that might have bearings for how we understand the composition of the Talmud. And this is one reason, it's not your only argument, but one powerful argument for considering that the Talmud actually was based on pre-existing written sources, right? So that's one thing that stood out to me. The other one is something you already alluded to, and we'll come back to, is like, well, okay, if the Talmud was based on written sources, on what kind of materials, surfaces were they preserved? You alluded to papyri, to ostraca, which we might talk about in just a moment. But this leads me to my second question, and you can respond to anything I just said there about the genre of the Talmud. Because in the first chapter of your book, you discussed this question. And I'm going to read a quote here from page 46 of your book, where you say that the Talmud, quote, is broad in its outlook, like a miscellany, presents its material as a conversation like a symposiac text, and follows the content of the Mishnah, a second century late Hebrew work from Roman Palestine, like a commentary. End of quote. There's a lot there to unpack for our audience. One thing that I find intriguing about this quotation is your suggestion that the Talmud is a symposiac commentary. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the genre, what you think, what kind of work the Talmud is.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, genre is a very complicated category to talk about in antiquity, because there were no, people did not have the concept, or they had different concepts of genre. There was certainly poetry and not poetry. That was the main distinction. And then we have books that align themselves in a pedigree with others through their titles. Like there is, for instance, a lot of titles start with the Greek pros, about something, about this topic, about that. And then, as I said, we have in the Roman period, we have a lot of miscellanies that pop up, and they have also very miscellaneous titles. Which Jane Heath said it's because, of course, they have not one content, so are very metaphorical. The treasure, the honeycomb, or the natural history, for that matter. So we can say the miscellany sort of constitutes itself as a genre. Also, Pliny lists a lot of these titles in his preface. Gellius does so. He lists 30 titles. So yes, they do have ideas of genre, but they're not like ours, so to speak. But we need to talk about genre. So commentary is also something we see that constitutes itself as a sort of a genre. And then we have a lot of dialogues, right? Dialogue genre. Where table talks by Plutarch, for instance. So the Talmud, it seems, And it's funny that you actually said something a bit mean about the Palestinian Talmud in the beginning. Who reads that one? Actually, I think it's the opposite way around. The Palestinian Talmud actually invented the Talmudic genre, but the Babylonian scholars just could step on the shoulders of the Palestinian one, and of course did not mention what they did because that's what no one does. You don't mention your competitor, right? No one does. Pliny does not mention the guys who wrote at the same time as he did by name. He just alluded to them, so because you want to stand out. So, but to come back, so what I think what the Palestinian Talmud already did and had to do, most of the work because it was the first time. They assembled the documents they had into a commentary that also mimicked a dialogue with their miscellaneous content, right? That they inherited, that they had in their library or probably more libraries. So my idea is that, yes, you can memorize a lot. We know that the ancients had clearly devised strategies to memorize things and a lot of things. But what you memorize is fixed things, like a text. It is very difficult to memorize an ongoing dispute. And our, rabbis are very pugnative. Or that's the picture that we are, that is conveyed by these documents, that they were arguing a lot. So how would you memorize such an argument? And then which argument would you prioritize? And how does this even work? And coming from ancient medicine, which I actually think was very effective in its own terms, but people died more often and younger. So if someone dies who's memorized so much, the knowledge is gone. The knowledge is gone. How can you secure that knowledge? So this is one, maybe I'm rambling here, but I know Isaac, you will make a summary for the listeners. But
Good, good.
what is also a thing, I'm just writing a review about a new book that has come out on rabbinic history, which is a great read. But then I think, do we really think that there were always these significant things that happened to the rabbis? Like, did they always communicate in these meaningful ways, and their lives are just full of these little episodes when they encountered someone and they said something very sharp? Do we really believe this, or do we go back to the ancient rhetorical curriculum and look how people learned actually to write texts and then realize that proverbs really played a big role in how young people already on a very primitive level of rhetoric, where you don't need Homer to understand the text, how they learned how to write small and short text, because they were not told, okay, now you know the alphabet, you know the grammar, write about your last Shabbat, or they were given a small piece of text, and then they said, okay, now exchange the dialogue, or which proverb could fit this text now. And so we have tons and tons of little episodes called chreya, which end in a significant piece of wisdom to take away. But this is not, they might be inspired by, things that happened, but they were deliberately crafted and changed again and again. And I was hinting at that when I said there is usually the idea that texts are fixed and orality changes everything. But actually, if you look at the ancient curriculum, the texts are constantly changed. So this is not something we can blame on orality.
Right, yeah, actually piggybacking on the last point you made, just for our viewers, our listeners, I mean, your argument is not just, oh, the Talmud was a written text from its inception, basically, because we can see that other Greek and Roman texts were based on written texts. Your argument is also based on the manner in which these texts, I'm speaking of the Greek and Roman texts, were written. You can look at the compositional strategies. You can look at the forms because your book especially analyzes the forms of texts to build the thesis about how the Talmud came to be. And you can say, hey, look here at this Greek or Roman work. It contains a chaya, and maybe you might define that for our audience. Is that like a little episode that might contain a wise saying or a moral that is applied to some sage or personality? How would you define that, chaya, for our viewers?
Yeah, what is super intriguing with ancient grammar is that it's very specific, much more
Okay.
than our grammar today, right? So, and the Chreya was a part of speech or a part of a text. It's just, and it's heavily theorized. So there is the saying, but there is also the action Chreya. So and the saying combined with an action forms an action chreya. So we have all these, and then there is the reminiscence, that's just the action and without the proverb. So there is a lot that is attached to this. So we cannot just say it's just an anecdote. It's always a piece of wisdom. And it may contain a name of someone or it may not.
I see. So it
And
could be. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, but there are like even manuals, right? Greco-Roman manuals that tell you how to write a chreya and say
yeah,
this is how you write a sayings chreya. This is how
yes.
you write a action chreya. So
Yeah,
it could include a named person, say Socrates, right? Once upon a
yeah.
time, Socrates came and he has a word to say, and there's some kind of lesson to
The,
derive from it.
Right. And then you can also contextualize in what context did he say that? And that could be an assignment, right, for a class. Okay, now you have this word from Socrates, and now how do you contextualize it? So we
Okay,
we we
so
do
in
find
in a
this in the rabbinic literature all over, and it's a little bit a situation, and then the rabbi said something.
just as a recap, because we mentioned, so we were talking about the genre, and you were saying in some ways the Talmud is like a miscellany, and maybe some of our listeners like, what's a miscellany? Is that just a work that contains miscellaneous things, various topics put together into a book?
Yes.
Okay,
It's
yeah, that's
well,
the
it's
good short
actually
answer.
it's
Yes.
well, that's it's again a modern definition of a genre that is, yeah, that actually prides itself for being for showing off that the author is widely read and knows a lot of things and is able to arrange them miscellaneously or by topic, or it's just it's like a collectanea. It's like also one of the titles is Fruit of My Reading, which explains it very well. Like, this is all I read, and I bring it here together like in a handy library. And
And we have
like
multiple
Pliny the Elder
examples of
is a
this.
is a good
Uh-huh.
example for something.
Yeah.
It's a miscellany, but then again, he brings a structure into the whole work. He starts with the planets and he ends with the precious stones, and he makes a whole tour d'horizon through material matters, like what nature produces and how you can use it, and he arranges it thematically, and he uses over 300 authors to do that. So yeah,
Wow.
he does the work. He does the work for you. And
Yeah, which is, I think, an important little thing that you're saying there in passing is one author, right, is able to draw from all of these kinds of different sources and compile them together and compose a work. And that we have other examples from late antiquity, from Greco-Roman literature, And in some ways, right, when one comes to the Talmud, you're like, wow, what is this? It seems to be going in all kinds of different directions. It contains a whole bunch of different discussions on various topics. So in some ways, it's like a miscellany. But in other ways, you're saying it might be like a commentary because it is based
Yeah,
on the Mishnah.
I would say it's a miscellany in the way it is produced, right? It brings together the
Okay.
different things into one structure, and it's the way it is operated. I was very inspired by an old article by two Swiss on Pliny the Elder's way of composing his work. And they said it actually looks like he used little tablets on which he stored the information together with a keyword. And then he copied relevant, he had his assistant read to him, his secretary or slave secretary or whatever. You said one person, yes, but with a team in the back. But yeah, I think what is interesting is that you can achieve this in a short amount of time if you really work on it. So I also challenged the notion of the Talmud was crafted through over generations of rabbis. I think this needs also to be done in a short amount of time. Otherwise, you lose track of what you're doing, especially because the material you're working with is very natural. It's very organic, right? It perishes. You have to renew it every now and then, otherwise it's gone. So if you don't mind, I would share my screen and just
Oh
talk a
yeah,
bit
please, definitely.
about the
That'd be a great idea.
I hope this, yeah. So this is something I put together and I call it the missing pictures. I'm actually, yeah, a bit sorry that I did not include pictures in my book to have probably made it easier. So usually I start by just giving a little pointer. There's a lot we're missing in ancient text production. Also, there is not much vocabulary that actually relates to text production, and we have no authors who say what they're doing. That's also why is Maaseh like a chaya? Could be not, sort of, like the ancient texts don't tell us, okay, here comes the chreya now. They just do it, right? So they just do it. They just produce the text. They don't talk about it, which is really intriguing because ancient authors, Pliny, for example, was very keen on highlighting his inventions in his preface. Like he boasted that he invented the table of contents, which is not exactly true, but you would think if he invented something new with how he produced the book, he would have gone on forever to explain it, but he didn't. So it was a very common practice. But so we have to figure out this practice, and I think we have to go back to everyday things they did for accountability, for instance. So, but just as a little pointer, there's a lot of material we lack, we miss because it's organic and it was not copied. For instance, we have very few plans of houses. We know that they used blueprints to build. We have all these huge monuments, and they must have used some kind of a blueprint, but we just don't have them. There are very few. These are two examples
Is there any way you could like put it on PowerPoint viewer?
Oh,
I
yes,
don't know, just so it
I
appears a
guess
little
so.
larger, if you're able to. Otherwise,
Yes, I am. I should be,
very
huh?
great.
So,
Wonderful.
yeah. So yeah, these are two blueprints which were used or not, and drawn from already existing buildings. The one on the left, and the one on the right is an imaginary perfect monastery that has been found as a palimpsest, like on the back of another text. So again, this is an example. This was not worthy to preserve, so someone wrote the legend of Saint Martin on the back, and that's why we still have it. There are, I think, two publications who mostly reproduce the same on ancient blueprints, who mostly reproduce the same data we have. It's very few. But we cannot say they did work, they did not use blueprints just because we don't have them. So again, the examples I'm going to show are not from Jewish contexts. We just don't have them. We have so few material. I just scramble what I get, and I try to show how we can see this material in the text and how it left its imprint on the text. But I don't have the Talmudic backstory, actual, documents that they used. So, but the idea by Rotlander and Locher, who wrote this a piece on Pliny, was that he copied or had his secretary copy the text they read to him on small tablets by topic. So there was a little piece, let's say on lead. He said, okay, copy that. And then they put the keyword lead on it. Or there was something on menstrual blood and how you can use it. So he said, copy that and label it menstrual blood. So they put a keyword on it. And we don't have these tablets, of course, but we found a lot of them by chance in 2 military camps. One of them is in Vindonissa in Switzerland. These are some pictures I took in the museum there. These are really small tablets, like the size of a postcard. And they were also used as tickets, as receipts, as letters, all kinds of things. So, and then once Pliny would go back to write an entry on menstrual blood or lead, he or have his slaves go take it, the box with the copies, the little slips with notes on menstrual blood on them, excerpts from other authors, and then he would compose his commentary. And the advantage would have been that these are loose pieces, you can arrange them, and only then you have to spoil your valuable papyrus with a draft. So you can already pre-draft. You can put it into an orderly, meaningful sequence. Oh, sorry. And then, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay,
perfect.
sorry. I lost my earbud. So, and then only then copy it. So this thesis by Locher and Lotlander has rightly been criticized as being a bit too neat and a bit too much like, the cards that we use, the flash card system that we use today. But there is much to be credited in this system. They also said they can actually see that some excerpts were misplaced and used under wrong keywords because nobody had the content. By the time they would work with the excerpts, they had lost the context, right? So this is one idea. Another thing is people wrote a lot on ostraca, pottery shards. There are whole archives that have been found with pottery shards. One way to connect those is also by keywords or catchwords.
Can I just interrupt you there? So ostraca, those are pottery shards, right? So these are just pieces
Pottery shards, yeah.
of pottery
Yeah.
that they would
Was
use that to scribble stuff, write stuff down on it,
yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah, these are broken jars from broken jars or plates. Yeah. So whereas the tablets were actually designed for the purpose of writing on them, these are just chance shards, because
So
the
there's like a
pottery was very
hierarchy, right?
smooth.
Ostraca's really cheap. I mean, it's a broken piece of jar. Then you have tablets purposely designed for writing stuff on them. And I guess papyri is yet a step up because that's more expensive.
Yeah. And then
Okay,
comes, yeah, and leather is a bit on the same level as papyrus, and then is parchment, of course.
parchment.
So
Okay.
refined skin. But actually, ostraca, there's a lot. It's cheap, of course, but then also it's very durable and has a
Hmm.
smooth surface, so it's well suited for writing. The problem is that, yeah, as you say, you really have to think about what you're gonna write and how big your shard should be, and it can limit you. And that's something that also intrigued me, right? We have a lot of small formats like the Chreya. It's a very short story, and actually it makes complete sense because the materiality of writing limited people anyways. So you better get to the point fairly quickly. Um,
Does
so
that
yeah,
help explain why the Talmud sometimes is so concise? You know, so few words and there's so much packed into it.
yes, that certainly is also one of the reasons why they use that. And also because I think, yeah, they had these writing habits. But yeah, you
Hmm.
always wanted to save on parchment, on papyrus, on whatever material, and on
Hmm.
ink. Yes.
I'm sorry if I'm interrupting you too much, but I'm just thinking out loud with you. This is very fascinating because it provides a very, what I appreciate about your work, a concrete way to visualize the Talmud as a composed text, if it was composed in this way, right? Very often I think, even myself, I admit, I just have a very blurry, before reading your book, a blurry, fuzzy understanding of how the Talmud came to be. Well, you know, it was oral traditions. People were really good at memorizing stuff, period. Here we're seeing how data, because that was the second right chapter of your book, deals with data management. I like the title of that. How data was stored and on what surfaces and how they were put together. So it gives us a really nice way to really picture this. Appreciate that.
Yes, and you also see that, yes, maybe the Blocher-Rotlander thesis was too neat. We also have to
Hmm.
include this materiality and think of Ostraka, and that people already wrote and composed small texts, and that not necessarily you had to take excerpts, but that these texts were already concise and you just had to label them, for instance. And you also see that this type of writing is very different from a Torah scroll writing, right? This is
Right.
so Haran wrote a paper in 1988 about a passage in the Talmud and in the Midrash where it says that the fetus in the womb of the mother is like a folded um, scroll. And he was thinking about that, and he actually showed that this is the thing we have to imagine. This is the folded scroll. It's like a concertina-like construction. It's tablets or sheets like sewn together. And this is actually what you see, right? In the Talmud is full of stories, and you can always you see that these stories are composed out of little units. And sometimes you have the same story with the units a bit reversed in a different place. And then you can just imagine, okay, this is what it looked like in reality. And then you can untie the strings and you can play with these units. But also, the materiality forces you to compose units, to write in concise units. And maybe the units were not all about Solomon and Ashmedai, but you can change the name to Solomon and Ashmedai, and so you can, construct an entirely different story.
Right, because for again, for our listeners and viewers, sometimes the same story or the same saying will be recycled, or it will appear again in another tractate or another section of the Talmud, right? So maybe this was drawn from pre-existing sources that were rearranged accordingly in the sections where they appear in the Talmud.
Yes, and again we see that writing is not fixed, right? You can you can play with writing even in that way if you don't change it concisely. I think and this is another example from a codex. It's a medical codex, but you see even the layperson sees that there is different writing on this papyrus. So ancient readers were very engaged when they were reading, they were commenting on it. So we have a lot of papyri that show that people have been annotating and writing onto the text. And this is another way, I think, that the dialogues that span sometimes generations of rabbis, right? There is one rabbi from the first Amoraic generation talking to an Amorah from the fourth generation, and you think, huh? Do we have to revise the whole chronology, or how does this work? And I think this is actually how this could have worked, because papyrus, if stored rightly and tended to, is very durable. It can last for generations. And we know that books have been passed down. They have been inheritances, valuable inheritances. So this is how different voices come together over generations.
Yeah, that's
And
very
short
interesting.
voices, very short voices, because you don't have a
Okay.
lot of space again.
Yes, yeah, you have to be very economical with the material you have, which is there are limited resources, limited space. But just that point you were making of how in the Talmud you can have it seems like it has to be either an imaginary conversation that was constructed by whoever wrote the Talmud, or we have some kind of chronological historical problem here because you can have, for example, I don't know, say Rav Ashi from end of the fourth, beginning of the fifth century, and then you have Rabbi Yochanan from who might be even from a different place, not from
Yeah, yeah,
Babylon,
exactly.
but from Tiberias in Israel, responding, and he lived, in the third century CE. So how could they be arguing with each other? And so here, well, maybe this is yet another hint or proof that there were material was stored in writing on papyri, on ostraca, on tablets, and then they were put together by the writer with the team that helped this writer or writers to write the Talmud.
Yes. And also, I think it's a mix of both, right?
Okay.
There are certainly passages where something like this could be in the background.
Mhm.
And then there are really fictional conversations. I mean, the Rabbi Yochanan you mentioned, he pops up in the Talmud all the time from like the back line. Oh, yeah. And here's, I also have something to say about it, or I did this as well. And it's like, what? No, I don't think he would. This is not something that you would write, right, into a papyrus. I mean, this is again the composers of the Talmud really
All right.
drawing from this genre of symposiac of literature, of dialogue literature at the dinner table, like imagining, okay, they are constantly talking to each other. Here we have a saying that works, that fits right in because he says something, and here we have to, like remind the reader that this is actually a conversation because we just inserted a piece that is anonymous and no one is actively saying something, right? Um, and here, this is just an example of a table, it's a duty roster for priests. And here is one from the Roman imperial period. It's a salary roster and duty roster. I think we have to contextualize the rabbinic project more in these terms as well. Like I said, there must have been a team that composed the Talmud in a considerably short amount of time. So why not think of a duty roster and who works on what, on which keyword today and which lemma from the Mishnah, which word from the Mishnah. At the same time, why not imagine such a roster to organize the library and to indicate what is where or which Amora said what and where is this located? So yeah, this is just uh, something I think we should more include when we think about how this type of literature came into being.
No, right.
And
That
this is
makes a lot of sense. Actually, if I might actually ask a question that I wanted to ask anyways, just occasioned by the rosters that you're referring to as a way of assigning duties, of arranging data. In the Talmud, very often you see uh, a discussion going on. Rabbi so and so, I mean, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Ploni, whoever. We can take a rabbi. Uh, Chimes in, shares an opinion on the topic at hand that is being discussed. And then suddenly, what the Talmud does is like it shares another teaching of that same rabbi. And Rabbi Tarfon or Rabbi Yochanan, whoever, also said, and it's on an entirely different topic, seemingly at least. Um, how would your, thesis, or does it, I don't know if you have any ideas about this, clarify or help explain that kind of phenomenon? Is that due to precisely this sort of data storage arrangement? We have some teachings here that are on file in the name of Rabbi so and so. And here's an occasion to insert it into the Gemara, into the Talmud, because we've just mentioned this rabbi. And so while we're at it, why don't we add something else that this rabbi said, even if it's on a different topic? I don't know if my question is making sense, and whether your thesis helps or pertains to this matter.
well, in that case, I would say, okay, these two sentences were on the same tablet
Okay.
or ostrakon, and they were just stored under one keyword. And so the one dragged the other one with it.
I see.
And sometimes we even see them in two separate places because two keywords have been assigned. So yeah, this is how I would explain this, how this comes into being. I just wanted to show this last picture. Kilian Fleischer has been working on a papyrus scroll, a charred papyrus scroll from Herculaneum, and which has now become more legible due to scanning. And it's actually the only draft we have so far of a text. We know there were two texts of the kind. We know one is a simpler text, and the other one is the more complicated text, but it's not finished. So it seems like Philodemus was working on an updated version of the history of the Athenian Academy, but he could never complete it, maybe because of the eruption and maybe just because he lost interest. But what is interesting is that it's a draft. There are notes on the back that should be moved to the front and additions everywhere. Most interestingly for me is that Fleischer says that you can actually see the tablets that were in play, because sometimes there is a column inserted into the text and it just fits precisely. And he says this precision you can only achieve if you can measure the text beforehand. And also the structure of the text is such that you can see that there were small units that are aligned. So
That's fascinating. Yeah.
I think this is just my little
It's exciting to see that last photo, right, from the Herculaneum, which currently there's a lot of investigation going there. Thanks to the progress of technology, uh, we're able now, or those who are privileged, lucky to work on deciphering texts that previously were not accessible, are able to now analyzed those texts that were covered by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, right, in 79 CE, along with Pompeii. And so not only are we learning about what texts were written there, but how these texts were written, which is very important for your thesis on the Talmud. So, maybe I can just I wanted to still clarify a couple of things and perhaps ask you one more question because of time here. This is a really exciting, fascinating discussion about the genre, because we talked a bit about how the Talmud is sort of like a miscellany, You're stressing that, genre is an iffy category. I get that because for one thing, the way books were classified in antiquity is not quite the way that we classify books today. So back then, basically, you have poetry and non-poetry. But in some ways, the Talmud is like a miscellany, contains a variety of topics that have been put together in a particular way. In other ways, it's like a commentary because it is a text roughly following another text. That's the Mishnah, its base text, so to speak. But then it's also like a symposiac text, I think is that how you said that again?
Yeah.
So symposiac commentary. I guess you're specifying how this commentary works. Maybe you could just say a little bit about that. What is a symposiac commentary?
So we have the biggest or the best example is actually Athenaeus learned banqueteers, right? Athenaeus has written a long text in which he uses excerpts from earlier texts around on different topics, again, wine, fish, more, food related and symposium related issues there. But he assembles what prior authors have said about these topics. He pulls them together, and he has these imaginary guests at his dinner table, and they talk to each other using as many of these excerpts as possible, right? And oh, this reminds me of this poet. And then he said, and he puts a quote in his mouth and he says that. And then, but he objected, but did not this guy say da da da? And so they quote constantly or use the knowledge of someone else to boast of. So he puts this dialectical spin on the excerpts, right? And I think that the Palestinian Talmud tried that first to achieve that, because there were already so many chreya and sayings in their material. It was actually quite easy. So it tried to combine this with a commentary on the Mishnah. Like you have this little note from the Mishnah. They talk about this, or it gives rise to a whole exploration of a certain word or what they meant in the Mishnah. And they just arrange it so that it could look like a dialogue. And the
Right.
Babylonian Talmud there definitely steps up the game with, interjecting questions anonymously, or even, using Rabbi Yochanan as a as
Right.
as a dinner guest. Or we don't know, do they imagine a dinner or the Sanhedrin or whatever? They just or just the Beit Midrash, the schoolhouse, what actually is in front of their mind. But what I mean with that is that, yes, they follow the text of the Mishnah, more or less, right? And they arrange the miscellaneous material they have arranged according to keyword in a way that looks like a dialogue.
Like a dialogue that we see in works that talk about a symposium, a meal, a banquet where there are guests speaking together, deliberating about
Yeah,
various topics. We can go all the way back to Plato's Symposium, right? And you have
yes,
Socrates and others who are discussing about various topics. And I can see that. I found that very fascinating because we have the Talmud then. It is very dialogical. There's one rabbi chiming in, another rabbi interjecting and going back and forth. Is this happening in a Beit Midrash, in the school of rabbinic learning? Is it happening in a synagogue? Is it happening at a symposium? Who knows? But there's, I think, intriguing promise there to really think about both the Talmud and these other symposiac texts, if I may put it that way, in
yes.
light of one another.
And in mimicking this table talk, they want to set an example, right, for young people, for the unexperienced, and how to behave and what to talk about at a table
Mm.
talk. So they are not just mimicking the table talk, they're also pedagogically useful, right? And also they can serve as an entertainment at a table talk when they are read out loud. And I really, now just maybe to come back to what I said in the beginning, the Talmud is
Yes.
like a box of chocolate. You never know what you're going to get. I really think it does that. The text does that to keep the listener intrigued. Like if it were just the legal discussions, it's just not as, enticing and fascinating to listen to. I really think, or came to the conclusion, that this text was written with the aspiration to serve as an instructional entertainment over dinner, which is not, we don't have to think always informally about dinners, right? Were also
Yes.
very formal dinners.
No, maybe this helps explain why so many people find the way the Talmud is written such a fascinating text. I think you alluded to that at the very beginning. What drew your interest into studying the Talmud? Maybe it's the form of the text. Maybe so. I'll get to the last question I want to ask you, which is more about when the text was written. I think we talked as much as we could within this kind of short podcast about how the text was written, on what it may have been written. But in chapter three of your book, which is titled Manufacturing the Talmud, you deal, among other things, with the relationship between the Jerusalem Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, claiming that the Babylonian Talmud depends on the Jerusalem Talmud and was written shortly after it. Could you explain why you think that's the case? And actually, you've kind of already shared some information about that, but maybe now you could talk about that. And that leads you to date the Babylonian Talmud rather early. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. As I said, usually authors did not quote their contemporaries. And a lot of research has shown that the Babylonian Talmud actually depends heavily on the Palestinian Talmud without mentioning it, right? And I have also the analysis, the probes I made of commentaries to Mishnaic lemmas also showed that sometimes the keywords seem very strange, but when you go back to the Palestinian Talmud and the same entry on that lemma, Mishnaic lemma, you see where they got the idea for particular keywords from. So they were always like having an eye on this other composition. And I think the fact that they do not mention that is indicating a chronological proximity. And also the recipes I analyze and everything, it just fits in a very early period. And also the interest in using excerpts and arranging excerpts, it just fits into this time period of the 6th century and not much later.
Not much later. Yeah, I mean
And also the
the
knowledge about how the Talmud was produced obviously got lost over time. Like the Geonim clearly idealize the production process.
right. It's a problem that you mention, is that within the Talmud itself, there isn't really any description of, oh, this is how the text came to be written down. Of course, there are stories about oral transmission of traditions. So we have to then go to, or many people go to the Geonim, post-Talmudic rabbinic sages, and they share their understanding, their beliefs of how the Talmud came to be written. But presumably the Jerusalem Talmud preceded the Babylonian Talmud. I think that's not a controversial statement to make. And you see a dependence of the Babylonian Talmud on the Jerusalem Talmud. Given that we have very prolific authors, many from late antiquity, we don't have to just mention Pliny. We could turn our attention to Christianity. John Chrysostom, Augustine, he wrote a lot of literature. We don't have to think that this took necessarily, right? That's your thesis. This took generations to make. There was already written information. Maybe there was one writer with a team, of course, had slaves, secretaries, other
Students,
assistants, students
grad
who can
students.
sometimes be grad students who are slaves. We know what that's like in academia, so to speak, and that was put together in a relatively short amount of time. Well, Dr. Amsler, thank you again for doing this interview with Talmud for everyone. I'm sure that this interview will stimulate the curiosity of many of our listeners who will be able to look
I hope
at the
so.
evidence that you have in greater detail, since we are now spoiled by the fact that the book is open access, but it can also be purchased if people prefer the paperback written material, as we were talking about earlier. Before we go, maybe you could just tell us a bit about what your current projects are and if there's a particular platform that our viewers might know about to follow your work.
Yes, well, not exactly. Well, I post a lot of my work on academia, but I'm working. I've moved away a bit from the rabbinic stuff into more classical thinking about Roman concepts of nature more broadly and how the miracle fits into their concept of nature. So, but I have been writing a bit on paradoxography and rabbinic literature. Actually, James Redfield just wrote the whole monograph about, so I'm more of an appendix to that. But and the Huqoq synagogue mosaic and miracles and wonder. So
James
I
Redfield
think.
is actually the next person that we're going to have
Oh,
here on
really? So
Talmud for
yeah,
everyone. So that's a good
great.
lead into the next interview for our listeners who are paying attention to this show. People can follow you on academia.edu. It's been Dr. Monika Amsler talking today to Talmud for everyone about her new book, The Babylonian Talmud and Late Antique Book Culture. Thank you, Dr.
Great.
Amsler.
Thank you, Isaac.